Hello and welcome to the Greenwood Military Aviation Museum, which is located just outside the main gate entrance to 14 Wing Greenwood. The mission of the museum is to acquire and display artifacts that represent maritime military aviation as flown from Greenwood and the maritime provinces, both at home and abroad, since the wing was formed in 1942. We have over 10,000 artifacts now that we have on display, including some 6 aircraft currently located outside in our air park and a good 3 airplanes that are on display inside, with more in the process of being restored for display in the future. The museum is made up of several parts: a main indoor display area, an extension where I'm standing right now, a memorial garden or commemorative garden, and an air park. Admission to the museum is free, so please feel free to come and join us. Check our website for our winter and summer hours. Come down, see the museum, spend some time, and learn a bit about Nova Scotia's history and heritage. Over the past 12 years, the Greenwood Military Aviation Museum has been presenting a very successful flight education or flight ed program, specifically aimed at grade 6 students, in cooperation with the classroom teachers and escorts from some 14 schools scattered throughout the Annapolis Valley and elsewhere. This program was conceived in 2002 at the initiative of a number of teachers, specifically Mrs. Connie Weinberg from the Pine Ridge Middle School, in association with the museum's director, Major Retired Lloyd Graham. Since starting some 12 years ago, the program has provided this course to 6,400 students and their escorts. However, we believe that the excellent work and educational opportunities offered by the Flight Ed program should be shared with others, hence this production of this media presentation so that it can be expanded to all schools within the province of Nova Scotia. The Flight Ed program involves several sections, including dynamics of flight, World War II and what the wing's squadrons were involved with overseas, plus the role of the wing with the British Commonwealth Air Training Program. We then move on to the Cold War period and primarily the role of the Argus and Neptune aircraft, and then on to the Aurora era as we are now with operations against Libya, Afghanistan, ISIS. We also cover search and rescue, the role of the helicopters, the C-130 Hercules, and the search and rescue technicians. There's something for everyone. The stories, information, displays, and educational material could only be made possible through the efforts of our living historians and flight instructors. Generally, 2 instructors are provided for each area. These instructors are mostly experienced military aircrew and support personnel, either retired or currently serving, along with a few trained civilian instructors. This mix covers a broad spectrum of expertise that not only benefits the students, but also has a positive effect on the team concept of instruction. We hope at the end of this presentation you are better informed and have a better feel for the dynamics of flight.
The CP-107 Argus, named after the Greek monster that had 100 eyes. And that's exactly what the Argus did when it flew over the skies of Canada and the North Atlantic and the Pacific as part of our Cold War warrior. But this is not so much about the story of the Argus flying low over the water, searching for a number of different intrusions into Canadian space, regardless of the weather, whether it be tankers, ships, freighters, or Soviet ships on the surface, or those that are under the surface of submarines. No, this is a story about teaching about the Cold War to the next generation. Welcome to Canadian Forces Base Greenwood in Greenwood, Nova Scotia in Canada. And this was the location of the largest Argus base in Canada during the Cold War. And this is the location where we have the flight education program given by a number of very dedicated volunteers who want to let the next generation know about the role that Canada played, the role the Argus and its crews played in helping prevent World War III. From loading up the Argus to the crews that manned the inside for hours on end, to the point where hopefully you never had to use any of the ordnance. This is the stories as told by those that flew in the Argus, and now I'll let them share the story.
Hi, my name is Bill Fraser, and along with Jack Brittany, we're here to provide information on the Argus environment, the Argus aircraft environment, and the Cold War, and how we used the airplane during Cold War years to hunt submarines. We used this museum artifact here, which was actually an Argus aircraft at one time, and then was turned into a trainer that we used in Greenwood for many, many years. And of course, now that we don't use the Argus operationally anymore, it's now part of our museum exhibit here, and we can use it to show people the actual air environment, the actual Argus environment, and how all the equipments worked, and how we managed to hunt submarines during the Cold War years.
Hi, I'm Jack Brittany. I was a navigator on the Argus, and so I've flown extensively during the Cold War. And so what I'm going to talk to you about is the Argus and a little bit about the Cold War. Okay, now the Cold War was a period of time between roughly after the Second World War, which was 1945 when it ended, to about roughly 1993. Now the Cold War in that period, there was no, they call it the Cold War because there was no atomic weapons used. There was all sorts of other little wars that went on, like the Korean War and a few other wars all over the place. But the Argus was built during the Cold War. In fact, the first Argus flew in 1958, and it was designed to hunt submarines during the Cold War. Okay? Now, so it was a large aircraft, crew of 15. You couldn't very well sit, and when I say large aircraft, it had long range. For example, you went out 1,000 miles, stayed 10 hours on patrol, and then came home. Now that's roughly a 20-hour trip. So the Argus has a record of 32 hours airborne without refueling. So it was a long-range airplane. But the Cold War, the reason for this bird built during the Cold War, because of the circumstances. There's a big reason, and I'm going to show you why. Come on down this way. You can see this map. Now here's Greenwood right here in Nova Scotia, right there. Now, like I said, we could go out 1,000 miles, which would be roughly in the middle of the Atlantic, stay 10 hours on patrol. Sometimes we'd go to Iceland, or maybe to England, or to Gibraltar, quite often to the little places called the Azores, and of course back to Greenwood, but all up and down the United States. Now the reason why is because up here, the Soviet submarine bases had nuclear-powered submarines with nuclear-tipped missiles, okay? Now, they would come down, and all they would do was just sort of sit and wait, and our job was to go out and find them, track them, and try not to let them know that we were there. So our job was to find these guys, keep track of them, and if the event that the war did break out, find them and sink them. Okay, this is what the Argus looked like inside. The pilot and the co-pilot and the flight engineer up front, of course. This first white area was a navigator and radio officer position. This next bit here was a galley, which had a fridge, stove, oven, and all that good stuff, lots of food, coffee. This area here, the second white area, is we call it the tactical section. That's where the business of hunting submarines took place, okay? Finally, the very back, we call it the ASW, or anti-submarine warfare position. See it right there? See those racks in the middle? Those were what we called Sauna Boy Launchers. Those were devices that we would put in the launchers, fire them out, and they would land in the sea, and they would transmit the noise of the sea back up to us. In other words, the only way we could find a submarine is by the noise that it made. Now, if we take these two white areas, slide them together, that's what we got here is the old Argus trainer, okay? This is the routine navigator section. Now, we had to have somebody at this position at all times for one reason, which the Argus did not have. A computer. So this guy here had to be here to find the position of the airplane when it's out to sea, because the thing is, there's no landmarks out at sea or anything like that. So he had to be very accurate on what he did. We had long-range radio navigation, as we called it. It was okay during the daytime in some areas, but there were some areas in the Atlantic that were blank. There was nothing. And at night, this was terrible. So as a navigator, I used this quite often. So did Christopher Columbus. It's called a Periscopic Sextant. And with that, I'd put it in, see that mount up top there?
Yeah. Oh, so you put it in
Put it in there, yep.
Oh, I've
and
seen
this,
that on the movies.
And this, about this much would be out in the slipstream. And with that, I could take a bearing on the sun, the moon, the stars, and the planets, and find the position of the airplane. The radio operator, now remember, this is during the Cold War. Everything was very, very secret. He carried the codes. By that, any message that he sent had to be coded up. Any message he received was coded, and he'd have to decode it. Those are signal cartridges. For example, now if we were working with Navy ships, they would not talk to you on the radios because there's usually always a Soviet, what we called intelligence gathering vessel somewhere nearby. If I fired that flare gun in the wall there and fire that, they look up in their code book and it says, oh, he's in contact with an enemy submarine and needs help. But tomorrow, if I fired that, it might, and they looked it up again, because of a different day, it might say, I've lost an engine and I'm going home. See the gentleman sitting there? That's the tactical navigator. In other words, as a navigator, I'd do 2 hours up front, 2 hours here, and then go find, for the next 2 hours, go try and find a bunk, get a bite to eat. So that's how it worked. It was all the positions, pretty much. Now then, he plotted all the information that these guys gathered back here. He would also drop and plot a Sauna Boys where we wanted to look for submarines. Now over here was the radar operator. For the Argus, it was mainly for keeping track of the weather, because the weather out over the Atlantic was terrible. Back here was what we call the acoustic operators. This is a Sauna Boy. Remember that picture I showed you out front there? The yellow objects, but it's a Sauna Boy. And what happens is when it's fired out of the chute in the back of the airplane, there's fins on the top that spin like a little helicopter. Now when it hits the water, this plate will pop off, the fins will pop off, water will get into a seawater battery, and what we have here, this hydrophone as it's called, or very sensitive microphone, will drop down to 100 feet, maybe 300 feet, depending on the selection, and it would transmit anything that it heard up to these guys up here. Now they were very good at what they did. Now this is called what we call a sonogram. This is what this particular machine would print. Now you can see that there's all kinds of lines and stuff on here. This, if I can find it, yep. Right there is a very, very thin line. That, believe it or not, is a generator on a nuclear submarine, Russian nuclear submarine. So the generator that produces this electrical power makes a noise, which they can interpret. He'll say, hey, I've got a submarine on buoy 10, which he dropped. He knows where it is. And so we've located that submarine and we've narrowed the Atlantic down to a few square miles. Yeah.
I'm Ernie Supple. I was 16 years as a fitter in the RCAF, and the last 4 years a flight engineer, and I flew on the Argus aircraft. And this is the position on the aircraft where the flight engineer works. We're flying, and the engineer is responsible for all the controls for the engines, the throttles, prop selection, and fuel selection. Also, we monitor all the gauges on the aircraft, and there's one set of gauges for every engine. The engineer is responsible for all settings on power given by the pilot in the left-hand seat. On takeoff, the pilot will call for a wet or dry power. And wet power is a mixture so that we can go to 180 torque with the RPM. The engineer, when he gets the command, opens up the throttles, make sure the pitch is in fine pitch, takeoff pitch, and all the fuel selectors are in the right positions, and we monitor the torque and the RPM going down the runway. And when we start to take off, the pilot will call for 2600 or METO power as it was called, and we will bring the throttles back to 50 torque and the propellers back to 2600 RPM. The lever that the engineer controls controls all four propellers through a master electrical control, but it also can control manually if we have a problem with electricity part of the control system. The only time the pilot handles and the throttles on this aircraft is when we land and he puts the throttles into a reverse position so that it helps slow down the engine. And then we taxi back into the hangar and shut down the aircraft.
And the last engine shutdown was in 1982 with the landing of Argus 742 at the Canada Aviation and Space Museum in Ottawa, Ontario. There are still some Arguses out there, and most of them are gate guards, such as in Comox, BC, at the Air Force Museum in Trenton, Ontario, at the old Canadian Forces Base Summerside, and of course, entrance to the Greenwood Military Aviation Museum in Greenwood. Canadian designed, Canadian built. And if you'd like to know more, the book by Kerry Baker and Bert Campbell would make a great read for anybody to learn more about the Argus and the Cold War.
I just want to say how pleased we are to have you again today. You were exceptional students. You really helped us by being on time and paying attention and asking questions, and that's important because that's why we're interested in what we do here as volunteers. We have about 70 volunteers that are in the museum at one time or another, and today we had about 20 so that drive in here just to teach you about the technology and the history of this base. A part of the history of this base was the kinds of airplanes that flew, but we can see this one. This is a very unique one. This one was built, this big yellow plane here, was built in Amherst, Nova Scotia. They had a factory there in 1941 during the Second World War. Canada was building airplanes for the war effort in Europe. And so they had a factory there that was building Ansons. This was a bomber. Quite a different kind of bomber than you see around now, and I think you've seen those things in the display. Well, before it became this, it looked like this. It was just a frame, just a metal frame, and a couple of engines and the nose cowling, and that's all we had. And that was shipped to us from Wetaskiwin, Alberta, from the Reynolds Museum, and they do those kinds of things. Other museums support us, and Reynolds Museum sent us this stuff. These people, 10 of them, spent 16,600 hours rebuilding that airplane to what you see there. They're all volunteers, come in a couple of times for 3 or 4 hours a week, and they spent 5 years building that airplane to what you have now, because it's part of your history, part of our history. And so it's quite unique. It's like a glider, actually. When you look at it, it's not metal. Inside, and when you're walking out, look at that little model over there. All of the wings and all of the fuselage area made out of wood underneath, and it's covered with fabric. They put Dacron on this and they stretch it and it becomes tight. That's what I was saying, more like a kite. It had 2 bomb bays and 2 engines. Now it wasn't a frontline bomber very long, but it did sink a couple of submarines during the war early on. But the technology changed very rapidly in the Second World War and it became outdated. So what we used it for on this base was to train aircrew. We trained pilots and navigators, and we trained the ground crew for the war in Europe. So people came here and they learned to fly, and then they went to Europe and they learned on other airplanes over there that they were using in Europe. So a little bit of history. Amherst, Nova Scotia had a factory. They built airplanes during the war, and this was one of them that came from Amherst. So we're really pleased to have it here. And maybe when you come back again with your parents and bring them back, you can explain all that to them. And we're going to put another bomber behind this. We're building another one out back in the warehouse. It's going to take another 3 or 4 years, but it's a metal bomber that was about the same era as this one, and the 2 of them will sit in here and be our display aircraft. All right.